I was holding her hand when she opened her eyes for the last time. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and something else I couldn't name. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the end of everything I knew. Sarah squeezed my fingers with whatever strength she had left. Her lips moved, and I leaned closer because I knew these would be the last words I'd ever hear from the woman I'd spent 43 years with. What she said changed everything I thought I understood about life. She whispered, "You wasted so much time being angry." Those 7 words hit me harder than the cancer diagnosis 3 months earlier. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to defend myself. But she was right, and we both knew it. I'd spent decades mad about things that didn't matter. Mad at the neighbor who cut down our oak tree in 1987. Mad at my brother for missing our wedding anniversary dinner in 1995. Mad at the restaurant that got our order wrong last year. Mad at drivers who cut me off. Mad at politicians I'd never meet. Mad at the weather, at my knees that creaked, at movies that wasted my time. Sarah had begged me for years to let things go. She'd say, "Robert, why does this matter so much?" And I'd explain why I had every right to be upset. I'd list my reasons like a lawyer making a case. I'd prove my point. I'd win the argument. But what did I win? Now she was dying, and I was finally losing something that actually mattered. Her breathing got shallower. The monitor beeped in a rhythm that felt like a countdown. I thought about all the dinners where I'd complained instead of tasting the food. All the sunsets I'd missed because I was too busy stewing over someone's careless comment. All the times Sarah had reached for my hand and found it clenched in a fist. She spoke again, softer this time. "Promise me you'll try." I promised. I would have promised her anything in that moment, but I didn't really understand what she was asking. Not yet. That understanding would come later, in the hardest year of my life. The funeral was on a Tuesday. People said kind things about Sarah that made her sound like a stranger. They talked about her volunteer work and her famous apple pie. They didn't mention how she'd laugh so hard at stupid jokes that she'd snort. They didn't mention how she'd dance in the kitchen while cooking, even when her hip hurt. They didn't mention the real Sarah, the one who lived in all the small moments I'd been too angry to fully appreciate. I went home to an empty house that still smelled like her lavender soap. Her coffee mug sat in the sink. Her reading glasses rested on the arm of her favorite chair. I picked them up, and something broke inside me that I didn't know could break. The next morning, I woke up furious. The grief counselor said anger was normal, but this wasn't grief anger. This was my regular anger, right on schedule. I was mad that the newspaper landed in the wet grass, mad that the coffee maker took too long, mad that someone parked too close to my car at the grocery store. Then I remembered Sarah's words. "You wasted so much time being angry." I stood in the cereal aisle, staring at boxes I didn't want, and realized I was doing it again. Even with her gone, even after promising, I was choosing anger over everything else. That's when it hit me that anger was a choice. I'd always thought it just happened to me like weather. Someone would do something inconsiderate, and anger would arrive like a storm I couldn't control. But Sarah knew better. She'd known all along that I was picking up anger and carrying it around like luggage I refused to set down. I left the grocery store without buying anything. I sat in my car and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not because I missed her, though I did. I cried because she'd tried to teach me this lesson for 4 decades, and I'd been too stubborn to learn it while she was alive. I started noticing my anger after that. Really noticing it. Like watching myself from outside my body. Someone would cut me off in traffic, and I'd feel that familiar heat rising in my chest. But now I'd pause and ask myself what Sarah would say. She'd probably laugh and say, "They're in a hurry, Robert. Maybe their kid is sick, maybe they just got scary news, maybe they're human and made a mistake." I started making up generous stories about people instead of assuming the worst. The man who didn't hold the door was rushing to see his elderly father. The cashier, who seemed rude, was working her third shift. The friend who forgot my birthday was overwhelmed with her own problems. I didn't know if any of these stories were true, but I didn't know that my angry stories were true either. I'd been making up narratives my whole life. I'd just been choosing the ones that justified my rage. My daughter Emma called one Sunday. She mentioned she might not make it to our monthly dinner because of her son's soccer tournament. The old me would have launched into a speech about priorities and respect. Instead, I heard myself say, "No problem. We'll do it next week. Tell David I hope his team wins." There was silence on the other end. Then Emma asked if I was feeling okay. That's how rarely I'd been flexible. My own daughter thought I might be sick because I didn't guilt trip her over a rescheduled dinner. We talked for an hour that day, really talked. She told me about her marriage struggles and her fears about being a good mother. She said she'd wanted to talk to me about these things for years, but was always afraid I'd judge her or get upset about something small she'd said wrong. I realized then how much my anger had cost me. Not just peaceful moments, but real connection with the people I loved. Summer came. The garden Sarah had planted started blooming without her. I thought about letting it all die. What was the point of flowers if she couldn't see them? But then I remembered her kneeling in the dirt, talking to the roses like they were friends. She'd say, "Anger kills everything it touches, Robert, but love makes things grow." I'd rolled my eyes at the time. Now I was on my knees, pulling weeds and crying into the soil. A neighbor walked by, the same one whose tree removal had fueled my grudge for decades. He stopped and asked if I needed help. The old me would have said something cold. Instead, I invited him in for lemonade. We sat on the porch, and I learned his name was Thomas. In 36 years of living next door, I'd never asked. He told me about his wife who had Alzheimer's, how he visited her every day, even though she didn't remember him anymore, how he kept going because love doesn't require memory. I told him about Sarah and what she'd said before she died. Thomas nodded slowly. He said his father had been angry his whole life, died mad at the world, mad at his family, mad at God. Thomas had watched that anger turn his father into someone nobody wanted to visit. He'd promised himself he'd be different. We talked until the sun went down. When he left, I realized I'd just had the best conversation I'd had in months. All because I'd let go of a grudge I'd been feeding for 36 years. I started wondering what else I'd been missing. How many potential friends had I pushed away? How many moments of joy had I traded for moments of righteousness? Sarah had seen it all. She'd watched me choose anger over happiness again and again, and she'd loved me anyway. That thought kept me awake at night. A year passed. I visited Sarah's grave every Sunday. I'd tell her about the things I was learning, how I'd started volunteering at the community center where she used to work, how I'd reconnected with my brother after a decade of cold shoulders over a fight I couldn't even remember starting, how I'd learned to pause before reacting, to breathe before speaking, to choose peace over being right. One Sunday, a young couple walked past, arguing loudly. The man was listing everything his wife did wrong. His voice had that familiar edge I recognized from my own past. I wanted to tell him to stop, to say he'd regret every cruel word, but people rarely hear wisdom when they're wrapped up in anger. I learned that the hard way. Instead, I whispered to Sarah's headstone, You saved me. Even dying, you saved me. Because that's what her last words had done. They'd planted a seed that took a year to grow. I wasn't perfect. I still got frustrated. Still had moments where anger flared up like an old injury. But now I knew it was a choice. Now I could set it down. I thought about all the people walking around carrying anger like I had, letting it poison their relationships, steal their peace, waste their precious time. I wanted to shake them awake, but you can't force someone to understand. Sarah had tried for 43 years. I only got it when I was ready to hear it. I'm 71 now. I don't know how many years I have left. But however many they are, I won't waste them being angry. I'll waste them on love instead, on long conversations and patient gardening, on forgiveness and second chances, on watching sunsets and really tasting my food, on being the kind of person Sarah always believed I could be. Her last words weren't a goodbye, they were a gift, the greatest gift she ever gave me. The permission to finally be free.